a second. All right, we're live. Hey, everybody, it's Phil Strazilla from Select Software Reviews. Thanks for coming back. Another chat with an industry expert here. I'm talking to Dan George of Piper Key about people analytics. We're going to dive into kind of things at a high level to get started. You know, what is people analytics, kind of core use cases, etc. I think there's going to be something here for anybody who's interested in this topic, whether you are a people analytics person. This is like what you spend your day in, day out. I've learned a lot from Dan, learned about a couple new technology tools that I wish I knew previously as well. And we're also going to kind of hit on some things like how do we get started if you're just starting off on this journey, maybe you're a chief people officer, maybe you're in a people ops role, etc. So Dan, thanks a lot for joining me. Do you mind just kind of giving a little bit of background on yourself? What do you do? Where have you been?
Yeah, sure. Actually, Phil, thanks for having me, and looking forward to this conversation. So, as Phil said, my name is Dan George. I've been in the industry now, almost 15, 16, 17 years or so. Mainly, the beginning of my career was focused on large systems implementations at a consulting firm. I spent a number of years kind of working with those systems, and I think one of the interesting aspects of kind of my previous history is that, as these systems kind of evolved, I was in this large consulting firm, and we started noticing that these systems were generating a bunch of data, but HR really wasn't using it for much. They weren't using it for analysis or insights. It was just kind of a transactional system that, you knew how many candidates you had, you knew the jobs that were out there, you had some details on payroll and some movement, but for the most part really wasn't analyzing how to optimize the workforce. And over the last probably 10 years, that has really changed really fast. And there's, a couple of things we'll talk about later today with the technology aspect that's come around. But it was really to the fact where more and more questions about, people, the skill sets, the trajectories that they have within their careers at these kind of corporate clients and industries, they started asking some of these questions, and HR sometimes had the answer, sometimes didn't. And I think that's where a lot of this developed, is that simply the business leaders or stakeholders had these questions, and HR needed to be able to provide answers, and sometimes they could and sometimes they couldn't. So the technology kind of came up around that, in which these, kind of the larger players in the beginning, your Oracles, your Workdays, SAPs, they started kind of creating some technology around it, but that's also where, some of these third-party vendors really started to come into play. And they developed systems that, were there. So kind of getting back to your original thought is I've been in systems and technology for a long time. And after kind of doing my stint at kind of a large firm, I spent some time in industry with Bridgestone Americas, grew that people analytics practice over 5 years. And then about 3 years ago, stepped out, started my own firm. And again, our focus is mainly people analytics, workforce planning, and then kind of your typical HR transformation projects. And that's pretty much covers anything from technology, process, those kind of aspects. And then we dabble a little bit with organizational network analysis as well, and we can kind of talk about that as an aspect of people analytics. But yeah, that's where we are.
Sweet. Thanks for the background. Thanks for being here. If you're watching this live, you can ask questions, and they're going to be a little bit delayed, but we will try to respond to those questions in tandem. If you're not watching this live, you're watching it, on our blog or whatever, at some point in the future, maybe reach out to Dan or myself if you have specific questions that are sort of burning that you want answered. Dan, before we get started, do you mind explaining, why is this important? Why does an organization or an individual kind of go through the process to develop a people analytics infrastructure in their organization?
Sure. And that's a great question, because a lot of people are still trying to answer that, especially if you're in an organization that's somewhat new to people analytics. So, again, I kind of bake it down to one, phrase almost, and it's that, HR is now, or has the ability to really add more business value to the organization than ever before. In many organizations, 2/3 of costs are in around salary, wages, and benefits. And if you don't have a ton of idea as to where where those costs are going in an organization, then you really don't have the ability to to optimize some of those resources that you're spending, right, every month. If especially even if you're a small organization, you're spending millions of dollars on your people, and do you really know that you're optimizing what's there? We kind of try to draw some parallels from marketing and even FP&A in the past, in that years and years ago, some of these organizations, they had a marketing budget, they would push marketing out into into the ether and just hope to understand how that marketing spend would gain more customers. And over time, the marketing analytics has just gotten a ton more specific, right? With all those web apps and ability to track and understand the cost of acquiring a customer, the cost of keeping a customer. And, that same parallels is drawn in HR now, but in, whereas marketing analytics is kind of much more in a maturity phase, the people analytics, again, for the most part, for most companies, is still pretty immature. But the same business value, again, can be added. It's HR's ability to add more value about optimizing resources within a firm.
It's really interesting. As you're saying this, I think that a lot of people that worked in marketing 20 years ago and sort of like the pre-HubSpot era, they don't work in marketing anymore, or they're sort of stagnated in their careers. And this sort of like new crop of people, some of which came in externally, some of which were just people that were in marketing that upskilled, they sort of dominated, right? They've got a little bit of the creative brain, they've got a little bit of the analytical brain, you put them together, and that's the new shoe marketer. And I think that we're sort of seeing this in the people operations function as well, where people who are really great at understanding the human side of things and understanding the analytical side of things are your chief people officers. They're the people who are, running people ops or TA at these fast growing companies, the unicorns, the decacorns, the Googles, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm a, individual, I'm listening to this probably pretty intently with like, all right, like, what do I need to do here? But before we kind of get into that, I was curious, you mentioned at a high level some of the use cases, but what are some of like the, 2 or 3 like core things that you see organizations using people analytics to understand or to action on?
Sure, absolutely. So, at this current, scenario, circumstance, within the market, talent has been one of these things that is very tough to get, find, and keep. There's certain aspects of, DEI or DEIB, however you kind of define it. That's diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. If you haven't heard the DEIB acronym yet, that's kind of the latest one that I've kind of adopted and started using. But there's all DNI or DEI, and those aspects are definitely huge, because when you're trying to understand the workforce and its optimization, a lot of it is trying to figure out, okay, of the workforce that you have, how many of them are engaged? How do you keep them engaged through the different trials and tribulations of a individual worker's motivations and aspirations to continue a career at the workplace? So I think that's a big one that's really come out recently. But if you're not quite there yet, I think one of the easiest places to start is within talent acquisition. Again, same market forces are existing right now, where organizations, big or small, are trying to get the best possible talent that they can, and understanding those avenues, those candidate pools, whether or not a talent segment is critical or not to the business. A lot of that depends on talent acquisition and understanding the type of roles that you have out there and the job descriptions that go and essentially market or advertise for those roles. And then understanding, okay, are you getting a solid candidate pool, right? Not only of skilled workers, but also, again, with, as I talked about earlier, the diverse backgrounds and aspects. Are you getting enough where the hiring managers feel like they have the talent that they need to execute on the strategies that they have? And so when you start to think about, okay, we have a job that went out there, how long does it take to hire this person? Are we offering the right salaries? Even kind of one of the biggest things right now is this role a remote role? Is it hybrid? Will I have to come to the office? What other aspects of this role are required? Again, one of the biggest things right now is, will I need a vaccine to work here? And so all of these aspects can be tracked through the talent acquisition system and these these job requisitions, and unless you have really good analytics on what's out there, it's tough to plan ahead. So if you have an organization of 100 people, we'll say, right, and you have 10 or 15 openings, but you also have a turnover, 10% or so, even if you are hiring at a pretty regular basis, you're still going to be short the number of workers that you need. So there's always this changing, and again, we draw parallels sometimes to supply chain of making sure that you have customers or candidates that are coming in that are filling the new roles that you have, but then also replacing the roles that you're losing as people kind of transition in and out of your company, or even within the company to different departments and whatnot. So being able to run that arithmetic on your workforce and understand that you have as close to full capacity for what your organization needs to operate, understanding that is a really key fundamental, and that's a really great basis to start, simply because now you're helping the organization and its stakeholders manage the skill sets in order to execute on, again, whatever their next strategy is, whether that's growth in their single vertical that they have, or kind of growth into new verticals, whatever that aspect is that the business strategy is trying to execute on.
Love it. And I'm interested that you gave a math example of a smaller company. And I guess when most people think about people analytics, I think they're thinking about, I've got like a people analyst and like a PhD on my team, and we've invested 6 or more figures into software and tooling and all this stuff. And I think a lot of companies, the Fortune 5000s, that's kind of what they're doing. But do you think this has a place in smaller companies as well? And I realize I'm leading you a little bit here, but I am genuinely curious about your thoughts on at what size or what scale does people analytics start becoming relevant for a company?
And that's a great question. So it's obviously my consultant answer is it depends. But I would say any organization that's got about 150 can definitely start in this realm. You get to a saturation point of kind of knowing everybody or understanding kind of what everyone's doing up until that point. And then once you hit that point, even for CEOs, C-suites, it's hard to really have a good grasp understanding of those different departments and how well they're running. That being said, I've worked with organizations, of about 50 people that want to do specific projects on certain parts of their operation, and I've worked with groups that are 100,000 plus that kind of want a larger sense of what's existing, what's happening, what are the trends within their workforce. But I would say 150 is probably the base minimum. You're really going to start to see some advantages around 500, and then anything over 1,000, I would push organizations to really start looking at building this out. A couple of my kind of current clients and whatnot, they're in around 4,000 or 5,000. They're private firms. They've been running really well for years and years, but they're starting to experience difficult problems with talent supply, whether that's at the corporate level or kind of at the hourly part-time level as well, whether it's in manufacturing or whether it's in call centers. They're starting to experience a little bit of these issues where they can't fill the roles that they have simply because they're not getting candidates with enough skill sets that they would want to hire, at least at a minimum. And so now they're trying to understand, okay, where are these candidates? How do we actually get them in? Is it a cost aspect? Is it is it employee value proposition, again, which we tend to talk about a lot, and that's an employee value proposition. I'll kind of explain here is simply the overall offering that you as a firm offer to the greater candidate or talent supply out in the market. And it's different for each firm, and you can have different aspects, whether it's flexible work arrangements or high pay or whatever that is. But within the market, is your EVP strategically set up correctly to get the candidates that you need? And again, a lot of firms are trying to figure out what that is right now. And if you're taking a guess, you're more than likely could be right. But that's where also people analytics could kind of help understand of the aspects you have the ability to change. like pay, like time, hours, career, motivations and career paths, are the candidates that you're acquiring or looking at, do they match what your EVP is offering?
Yeah, I like it. It's all about this marketing analog today.
I mean, these days it really is, because they have more options out there than ever before. And so understanding how you compare, to your industry and to your other competitors, whether it's local markets or national markets, it's a big thing. I mean, many organizations are trying to figure out. It's like, that's why you see these different kind of large tech firms that are offering full remote. Hey, we're not going back. We just want great employees. And there are a lot of employees that want to work remote, but then there are also a bunch of employees that don't. They want a hybrid environment. And so being able to understand kind of what that is, and how that, makes your business run efficiently or effectively or not is key.
Yeah, I agree. One of the trickiest things that or maybe most interesting that I've heard of from a people analytics perspective is I got to interview this guy, Sebastian Gerard, probably like 6 months ago. And he was saying that they've essentially built a crawler to look at the career websites for all of their talent competitors in different regions.
Mm-hmm.
And so they can actually predict attrition through saying, they're in healthcare, right? So it's like, okay, all these like kind of smaller, like ACOs, et cetera, that take away from our hospital nursing staff, there's 10 new recs. We know that 2 to 3 of them will become, will trip from our company. And therefore we need to hire 2 to 3 more people right now. And how do we do that? And they're looking at all these different signals, which I thought was like so smart and so cool. And I was just wondering, is there sort of like a favorite implementation of people analytics that you have, or something that you thought was particularly clever that you might want to share?
Oh, that's a good question. I like anything in that sense, because when I think about some of the organizations that are struggling the most that we end up talking about a lot, it's simply continuing business continuity, if you will. And a lot of that depends on ensuring that you have enough staff to operate whatever business goals or operations that you have. And if you know simply that there is a critical talent segment that essentially keeps your business up and running, you should have the knowledge of how that ins and outflows of that labor force exists within your realm, right? So if I remember years ago was working with a client that had finance groups, and they always kind of would have finance people come in at an entry level, or like 2 or 3 years out of school, and they had a couple hundred, and that they knew that they had to continually hire them month over month, because they knew that 3 or 4 would leave every month. And so they had this evergreen rec of kind of a finance requisition for an entry level, or at least a few years out, that would just kind of continually be open. And they would take in new candidates. They would always kind of be interviewing and always be onboarding, simply because they knew that's one of their critical talent segments for keeping their business up and running, but then also never to fall behind. Because a lot of times you'll go through a budget season, or you'll go through some kind of shift, and you'll need these analysts on board ready to go. And if you're always reactionary, then you are scrambling, you're having other people work overtime, and you're kind of creating this dissonance or even kind of the symptoms of disengagement, because people are burnt out or whatnot. Whereas if you're like this firm that kind of constantly had new blood coming in, everyone was used to change, you were never kind of understaffed. Now you've got a flowing operation that just understands that, hey, this is the way that we work. People move in and out of this job function or critical talent segment, and we're staffed appropriately to make sure that we hit all of our target dates throughout the year, no matter how many people we have coming in and out. And some groups have looked at that, or will look at that and be like, well, that's quite a bit of a cost. And I always come back with the fact that, well, if you're reactionary, you're almost more of at a risk, because you're going to potentially hire someone that's not as good for the role, simply because you have to have a warm body that's in there. You're missing on certain aspects of that continuity. And then again, you're probably again more risky for understanding, can you meet those dates if you're constantly reacting instead of proactively hiring that critical talent segment.
Yeah.
And some months you might be over what you need. Some months you might be a little bit under, but you're always kind of feeding that pool so that you're never way under. Because as soon as you get way under, that's when you start, having essentially mission critical issues with the workforce.
I guess thinking of sort of like the negative side of things, what are like the pitfalls of people analytics? Obviously when you start to think about human beings in terms of how you think about a process in a factory or something like that, there are obviously always are different pitfalls with that sort of framework that you can counterbalance, but they're there. I'm curious, have you seen any gross misinterpretations of data that had negative outcomes, or perhaps the wrong mindset when it came to these sorts of issues?
I think there's always a risk. We talk a lot about, just the security and privacy of some of this data because it can be sensitive. There's obviously sensitive aspects protected federally within these data sets that you need to be careful about. And of course, managers, untrained managers can certainly use some of this data nefariously, if you will. I tend to try to hope that people don't do that, but then you also set up security so that you don't allow the wrong people the right access to use it improperly. I don't think I can pick out anything where an individual has grossly misanalyzed anything, but there's plenty of cases out there where managers will use it as leverage to come to conclusions about either a workforce or a specific individual that necessarily aren't true. But if you've again have the right kind of place security placeholds like intact, and you have other kind of individuals that are always kind of monitoring some of that, I think you can do a good enough job to set yourself up to not have any large pitfalls. And again, like overall, we've seen some issues, let's say with the Amazon thing a couple of years ago, where they would get so many applications that they consistently end up using artificial intelligence to help them select candidates. But they trained the artificial intelligence model on past candidates. So it ended up picking essentially more kind of, I think white males than it did anyone else, simply because that's what it was trained to look at. And they ended up canceling that program simply because the AI ended up being biased. And so that's probably one of the most kind of egregious ones. But again, I think Amazon for the most part is still correcting some of that aspect, and they're trying to use it again. For the most part, I somewhat applaud them for trying, and applaud them even more for stopping the program when it wasn't producing the right results. But that's kind of in this space right now where we're trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. And so you're always going to end up being a little bit of a risk for that kind of stuff, especially when you're analyzing sensitive data. But again, the outcome or the impact that you can have in an organization to be able to use some of this data to make faster decisions is pretty impressive. And I think there's a couple other technologies out there like organizational network analysis that really could be used for good and shaping an organization, optimizing their resources. It's still a little bit new, and certain groups are a bit weary to start using it. But the ones that I've worked with that have really do see a great outcome and impact to how they manage their resources, how they manage their teams, their career paths, and again, how they reinforce positive behaviors. So I think there's, again, a really great aspect to the technology.
I want to get to O&A in a second, but before we do, I was just sort of curious, what's your advice to the 150 or 500 employee company that is like, you know what, I'm sort of convinced we should do stuff like this. Like, how do we get started? Do we need to hire somebody to focus on this? Or is there certain systems we should be looking at to extract data? Should we be using like, the dashboards built into our ATS, et cetera? Like, what's sort of the first steps?
Absolutely. I think, again, this holistically depends on what kind of resources are available to an organization of that size. I would have to assume if you've reached 150, you've got most of your operations set, and at this point, it's probably a good idea to try to find an HR professional that has experience with people analytics, or at least systems that, in such that they can set up some of the basic reports on HR data, on human capital data, that can start reporting on some of the absolute basics like headcount and turnover. Those are the kind of basic fundamental reports that organizations need to kind of ensure HR has a seat at the table. And kind of what I mean by that is you'll have operational reporting, you'll have FP&A, finance reporting, and then human capital reporting, I think, is just another aspect into that. Obviously, if there are individuals out on this call or out there in the industry, we've seen that there's more and more regulations that are going to be coming federally mandated that the SIC or SEC is kind of pushing forward. And with that human capital reporting, you're going to need to understand a little bit more about kind of your headcount and overall workforce. And those are some basic, really good fundamentals to have. Again, understanding how many people you have, what those costs are, and are they aligned within the right organizations, cost centers, and profit centers. That's massive for being able to report accurately on those costs. And then getting granular with your general ledger and GLs on how that costs or how those costs are being allocated and spent, I think is another great thing. A couple of years ago, I worked with a firm that was about 1,400 individuals. And while I was there, they grew to over 2,500. And we had some issues with simply reporting on where those resource costs were being allocated, because the overall org hierarchy was a little screwed up, and they had, in some cases, resources weren't being counted, and others they were being double counted. And so the financials essentially weren't as up to par as they should be. And simply by correcting kind of the organizational data within the HRIS, they were able to report cleaner numbers to their stakeholders and to their investors, and be able to return a smarter number on what they were spending in those areas where they were gaining new business. And so ultimately they were able to figure out that they could, in certain areas, add more staff, and other areas shift staff around, and again, making better decisions about optimizing their workforce, simply because they needed to fix their org hierarchy structure. And so, kind of to answer your point or your question, making sure that you have some of the fundamentals set up is really key. And again, this is all can be done in Excel or Tableau. Your basic, everyday Microsoft systems is totally fine. If you want to move on to something greater, applaud you for doing so. But again, I've run and set up many of these people analytics organizations simply with Excel for the first 2 years. It's not, obviously not my preferred tool anymore, but it definitely works. It can be done. And again, with an organization that size, it just typically is the right call for the costs.
Yeah, that's great. So it's not like we need to hire a PhD and create some sort of unified data model or something like that. We literally just need to take sort of the foundational stuff we've already got in the HRIS, we've already got in the ATS, et cetera, put it into some dashboards in Excel, maybe, export PowerPoint, whatever, just sort of some basic stuff. So it's here's the state of the world. And then if we have an initiative that's particularly interesting to us, then we should try to understand what are the metrics we should be putting around this to understand if we're right or wrong, and where do we get that data? How do we report on it, et cetera. And that's sort of, good enough for a long time. And then as your business gets value out of this stuff, you can graduate to more advanced tactics.
100%. And one of the things that I always try to talk with some of these organizations that are just starting is simply you're following the budget cycle. So if in year 0, you've now decided that the organization wants to report on more of this, you've got to set that budget line item in the very beginning so that you can either hire somebody or invest in having allocated resources for this endeavor, right? It's a project, right? And if you're going to do it, it's tough to make it a secondary kind of tag on to something else that their main responsibility is. So you've got to start it with finance as a project, in year 0. And then each year after that, as they show value, add to that budget and increase that budget. Rarely have I seen organizations kind of start out of nowhere and then all of a sudden make a $500,000 investment in ramping up people analytics. It just doesn't happen like that. If they've never made that investment before, you're just going to have to. It's really tough to get that amount of resources, on the books in the budget, for something that hasn't really proved any value out.
I think a lot of people out there have this notion that you're either like a left brain person or a right brain person, and a lot of folks in HR aren't like the analytical horsepower to do this sort of stuff. And I personally think that everybody can change and evolve, and I also think that stereotype is not necessarily true across many of the people teams that I know and interact with. However, if you're a C-suite person, or you're looking at yourself internally and you're like, I'm just not a numbers person, should you hire somebody to do this? Should you get somebody, get an FP&A analyst who's like a data junkie to help you out on this? Should you, get a consultant? Maybe you're biased there. But from sort of like a human capital perspective, you need maybe like a half an FTE or a quarter of an FTE to do this and get yourself set up. What's your advice there if you don't think you have the analytical, horsepower in the HR team?
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, straight out, I probably wouldn't be doing my job very well if I didn't say that. Yes, hiring a consultant or someone to help you think through this is a great way to start. It just gets you on the right path. See someone that's started some of these things several times before. Again, I would say that's 50 or 60% of my clients. They just want some help, really getting started. And then they look at, again, after a couple months of engagement, they'll look at hiring someone outside or like pulling in someone from somewhere else. But really just to get off the ground, sometimes it's developing that strategic, deck that you need to present to either a steerco or the executive suite. I do a lot of that simply just to kind of pull in the use case, the business cases, and then kind of understand what the cost structure might be to set up something like this. And I think that's it's the fastest way to do it, I think, is to have, kind of someone come in and help. Obviously, most FP&A analysts can do this. And believe it or not, I'm seeing more and more, especially in the less senior HR individuals, they're coming out of school with more analytics, more data savvy aspects to them. And a lot of them are interested and willing to take on some of this than ever before. I mean, I teach, grad level courses here at Vanderbilt in town. And a lot of them are, again, either coming right out of undergrad or into these graduate level programs with a few years of experience. And they have a lot more practice with data than what we've seen in the past, especially in HR. So the schools and education is definitely there a little bit already. And so you can get someone on that right path pretty quickly. Needless to say, there's a ton of online stuff these days where you can pick up, some great courses. Happy to kind of promote, some of the other partners and vendors that I've seen, like, AIHR is a great one, Insight 222, if you follow a couple of these guys on LinkedIn, like they've got, great resources for kind of getting started in people analytics. But I'll finish by saying, I think there are a lot of HR professionals that might shy away from this in the very beginning, simply because it is an all-engrossing, somewhat overwhelming topic to get started in, especially if you're not used to understanding data and systems and APIs and connections and that kind of stuff. But I really haven't met any HR professional within an organization that wasn't able to pick it up if they were interested and willing to do so. It's not that complicated of a topic. Again, depending on how far you want to get into it. Obviously, there's plenty, to go super deep in terms of stats and AI and other machine learning models and features and stuff that you can kind of push into this. But I would say any HR professional out there can definitely get into it if they dedicate the time to do so. But that's also difficult depending on kind of the level of job and responsibility that they currently have. So.
Yeah, I think it's encouraging, even if you don't view yourself as a numbers person. And I personally, and I'm sure you'd agree, given what you do for work, think that the ROI is there, right? Like if you're sort of looking at your time in a very coldly rational way, to upskill on people analytics is going to be worth your time for your organization as well as your own individual career.
Oh, 100%. I mean, we've done projects in the past that, let's say you'll spend a couple $100,000 on resources. So, dedicated time for 6, 8, 9 months, working on these projects, and some of the return that we'll see, for, again, 20 hours a week for a couple months, you'll see millions of dollars in returns simply because you're able to find a lot of just excess inefficiency that exists within an organization. And a lot of that is hard numbers too. It's not just we increased engagement, and every 10th of an engagement is $400,000. Like you can get to some of those numbers if the organization and stakeholders trust that, but I'm talking about actual GL line item, like hard costs on programs and time and all that. So it's definitely there.
Yeah, that's amazing. Do you have any specific example you could share of how something in the general ledger P&L was impacted by people analytics, and like how you kind of thought about translating what you did to the profit and loss?
Sure. It's a kind of an easy one with, and I'll give about as high level as I can. Essentially, it's called time to productivity. So as you hire or onboard someone within, either a manufacturing space or manufacturing, retail, even call center space, that individual, has, amount of time in the very beginning where they've been hired, they'll onboard, kind of conduct all the administrative tasks, they'll do some training on whatever tasks or operation that they're doing. And as, they repeat that task, over the course of a couple of weeks, then they become as productive or optimized. And if you start understanding what that time to productivity is, whether that's 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks or months, for a given level, you can kind of, again, see that this is more focused on, operational roles. But what we looked at is, for the time to productivity with an hourly cost of X and let's call it $15, $16 an hour. And then you have the cost to hire, which is about $850, per individual. That's simply just to get them in the door. And then another training on top of that could be anywhere from $400 to $600. So now you're, if you talk about the full cost of getting in, it's about $1,500 per individual. And with that, even if you were in this scenario, even if you were to increase the hourly wage of $1, by $1.50, but that $1.50 saved you in, overall turnover, you'd be saving, over the course of a quarter, again, depending on scale, I mean, you could save $2 or $3 million every quarter simply because you were retaining more of your talent, spending less on the hard cost to essentially hire and train someone, and your time to productivity actually shrank because you had more of the ability to train the right people and less of the ability to lose them before they became productive. And so there's plenty of cases simply just like that exist out there, especially for those types of roles that, can clearly give you, give those businesses some money back into the coffers at the GL ledger, kind of line item level.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. I mean, that's sort of like the holy grail of all this stuff is how do you do that? Then how do you kind of brag about it a little bit internally in a very educational way and get more juice to go and do the next initiative that you care about. And maybe it relates to something that's slightly more nebulous, like engagement points or whatever the case may be, but you sort of can say, hey, we're from that project, we're saving you guys $3 million a quarter and we want to do X, Y, Z. The answer is probably going to be yes. I know we're sort of like running towards the end of our conversation here, and I didn't want it to end without asking you, what is like the people analytics stack look like in terms of tools And are there any companies that you really like to work with from a tech perspective?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's great. Kind of I mentioned before, again, almost anyone can get started with Excel, Tableau, even Power BI is a great resource these days, especially because with most organizations that are Microsoft based, they have, they have the ability to sign in with those tools at a relatively low cost per user license. I even know several organizations that run off Google Sheets, and I even have a Google Sheets developer that I've worked with on several occasions that has done some amazing stuff with G Suite, just to, again, run some of these organizations. Once you kind of get past that initial maturity level and you start getting into something that needs to scale a little bit, again, I'm a big fan of Visier and OneModel, which I know are both highlighted on your website. I think there's some other really good organization. OrgView is another big one. I think there's some other groups out there that are doing amazing work with AI and technology and workforce planning. I can kind of write down that list, or if people have questions, I certainly can share more of those. It's probably too tough to list out, especially on this without kind of having that text down there at the bottom. But what I've seen over the last couple of years, which is really encouraging, is that a lot of these vendors, they have their typical offering, which could be, again, for a decent sized organization, could be a $150,000, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 line item. They're also offering for smaller organizations, some of the simplified setups to get you started. So if you did have some money that, you're looking at tens of thousands of dollars, you can get started with some of these vendors and get in the door, start using some of these analytics and start using some of the scale that they can provide at a much faster time period and on a, kind of a much better price point. And I think that aspect of the technology has really, again, began to accelerate some of that, because in the days of old, like, when I would, did some of this stuff in the early 2000s, right? I mean, we do, $9, $10, $12 million analytics systems. I mean, these are big companies, but that's what it would cost. You'd have a 40-person team and they'd be there for a year and a half, and we'd, make all these custom code and pull all these systems in together and make these dashboards, and it would cost an extremely large amount of money just to make that happen. And these days, you can get off with onto the road running within 8 weeks, 12 weeks, for some of the basic functionality. And just to get you started running with that, again, under $50,000, that's incredible. And so I've been really encouraged to see some of the vendors that are out there that are, again, have these platforms ready to go, plug and play for your basic, for your very kind of standard, large scale HRS systems that are out there. And it's just been a really fantastic way to see organizations kind of get up and running.
It's awesome. Yeah, it's so cool how all these tools have changed the way that work gets done. And I think we're going to continue to see stuff that's super powerful that you needed to, put on your own hardware or take a long time to set up for your organization. You can log in, you might even have access to this stuff. As you point out, if you're a Google company, you might have Google Data Studios. If you're Microsoft, you might have Tableau.
Yep.
Anybody can access Google Sheets, et cetera. It's amazing the tools that we have, and companies like even Zapier or Tray.io or whatever,
Yeah.
they're making it so you don't have to code the connections. You can drop stuff in, and so it's a really exciting time, especially.
That's the biggest game, is just not having to code as much. I mean, back in the day, 12 years ago, we would spend, months just simply like, coding connections. I mean, it was wild. And now it's just literally, you get your key, you text it in there, have a few security questions to answer, and then, wow, you're connected. It's wild. It's fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially if you're an entrepreneurial business leader. I mean, it doesn't really apply specifically to people ops, but you can do a lot of stuff on your own, and you can learn a lot of the stuff online. You can kind of take courses that give you bigger foundational knowledge. But if you just want to get like this thing done, like get this data into this thing and do this analysis, you could probably spend an afternoon and figure that out, depending on, the specifics of the project. But it's a pretty amazing time. Are there any sort of last things that you would leave folks with who are perhaps, maybe, I think there's probably two people watching this. One is somebody who's like, how do I get started here? And then there's probably another person who's like, okay, like, this has been great. I'm a people data analyst. What are, is there like a new tool that maybe not a lot of people know about, or something particularly interesting to put on those folks' radar as well?
You know what? A lot of the lasting kind of motivation that I'll give someone that's maybe already started, that has maybe had a little bit trouble getting a bit more traction. I encourage, especially analysts and individuals, kind of either lower on the totem pole or kind of maybe toward the middle, start having some of these conversations with your stakeholders. Get to know them, better by providing them with some of the basic information that they're asking for, but then try to get them to meet with you. Some of the biggest ways that I've been able to better serve our stakeholders is to have those one-on-one conversations, very light agenda. You walk in, ask them, even if it's 15 or 20 minutes, what's going on with your business? How can I help? Like, explain to me certain aspects of it, because a lot of times executives and other than HR, they'll have some idea of what you are doing, but you've got to help them make those connections too. And a lot of that's simply conversations on how is your business running? What are some of your, kind of trending issues that you've seen? If there's a decision that, you could, have made faster about your workforce, what could it have been? Get them to talk about that, because a lot of times they won't connect that automatically for you. Or they might not even connect it themselves. It's something that you can help with.
Right.
But as you sit down and have those conversations with them, more and more things will start to connect. And if you do that on a regular basis, you're building, you're building that connection, you're building that relationship, and they'll end up sharing more and more with you. And then you'll be able to, again, find those little projects and areas where you can deliver more value to them, henceforth growing your own discipline and growing your own skill set, then again, back to gaining more investment to, grow a bigger project team or grow a bigger discipline within the organization. I think that's one of the best things that I can, kind of tell people to go do. It's so easy to say that here, because it's daunting for anyone to reach out to an executive or stakeholder that they don't either know that well or are a little reluctant to do so. But I guarantee you, if you just ask people about their business, about their role, about what they want to complete, almost anyone will, talk on that. So just go listen, ask a bunch of questions, take notes, and then hopefully something will connect.
I love that advice. And I give it often, actually, when I'm trying to help TA leaders or HR leaders think through what tools should we be looking at. There are hundreds of different HR tools out there. Where do we focus? And one of my big frameworks that I really rely on is talk to the functional leaders in your organization and understand what are the challenges that they're having, and then map it back to what you can do in your function. And that, of course, is going to lead to ROI and that the business appreciates, which is going to, get you more internal juice to help you do other initiatives in the future. And if somebody is being shy, just realize you're not trying to sell this person anything. You're just trying to help them. You're trying to better understand their business, flatter them a little bit. I love that book, How to Win Friends and Influence People.
That's a good one.
I'm a big fan of the sales team and what you guys do. Can I learn more about what you guys are up to?
I've got another one. It's an old one, but it's a goodie. It's called The Trusted Advisor.
Okay. All right.
I think it's from the 60s or 70s.
Yeah.
But it's got a couple really great tips about just starting to talk with people and understanding kind of where they are, how you can help with them, and becoming a trusted advisor to them. You don't necessarily have to have some brilliant, subject matter expertise that is perfectly curated, that you've, gathered over years and years. You have a perspective, of whatever experience that you have. And sometimes you can offer that advice, but the more and more you talk to these people, the better off it gets about finding something that might make sense to work on.
Yeah, 100%. And it's a great relationship. It's going to help everybody. And I think it's phenomenal advice. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today and kind of just going through all this people analytics stuff. It's, to me, probably the most interesting area of HR technology. There's a lot of cool stuff going on. And I think there's cool stuff in, the employee mental health, the DEI, the TA stuff, but people analytics sort of ties it all together, touches literally everything. It is sort of this like next generation sort of judo stuff that can help the small organizations, can help the bigger ones, and really can help just sort of people, we spend so much time at work, enjoy our work lives better, in addition to helping,
absolutely,
things growing and all that good stuff. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge.
Well, hey, thanks for having me, Phil. Appreciate it. Enjoyed the conversation.
Awesome. And thanks everybody for tuning in. And again, if you have follow-ups, find us on LinkedIn. We're easy to people to follow. And thanks a lot.
Thank you.